Good day, everyone. How are you today? I hope you are feeling good because this time I will be discussing an exciting lesson, and that is the features of Italian literature. And without further ado, let's begin. But before that, let's just know what are the key points that I will going to discuss. So first is the importance of Italian literature, the major periods of Italian literature. Next is the greatest Italian poet. The fourth one is the three crowns of Italian literature. And I would be also discussing some famous Italian writers and their notable works. And the last is the Italian language. First, what is Italian literature? It is the body of written works produced in the Italian language, and it has begun in the 12th century. Importance of Italian literature. The Italian literature represents the rich culture of the country and depicts the future heroic legends that live in the country for ages. The chronicles, the historical poems, and the religious poems written in that era were all in Latin. And the other notable feature of the Italian literature is the epic poem of Dante Alighieri, The Divine Comedy. It is a dramatization of the medieval theology and philosophy. Divine Comedy is a guided through the three worlds known as the paradise, hell, and purgatory. The main part of the Italian literature is that it is often depicted in the form of plays, theaters, and movies, which try to promote the Italian culture in general and literature in particular. It called Italian literature to all literary production that has been developed in Italian language and by Italian writers inside or outside the country, but especially includes works developed in times prior to the creation or constitution of the state. In particular, Italian literature is one of the most in-word literature since its participation and invention in literary currents and movements will be the source of important changes in world literature. On the other hand, it should also be considered that Italian literature also includes an important religious content, especially because during the 13th century, a series of sermons that had been preserved in the Italian language and that had been written by many of its members increased and began to be observed. The first one is medieval period or Middle Ages, from 1200s to about 1400s. Early written medieval literature is mostly legend or folktale set down on a page rather than recited, but the storyteller still needed to gather and hold an audience and so wrote in the vernacular to be understood and in poetic matter to be remembered. The second one is Humanism and Renaissance period, from about 1400s to about 1550s. During the 14th century, a cultural movement called Humanism began to gain momentum in Italy. Among its many principles, Humanism promoted the idea that man was the center of his own universe and people should embrace human achievements in education, classical arts, literature, and science. Renaissance humanism is the spirit of learning that developed at the end of the Middle Ages with the revival of classical letters and a renewed confidence in the ability of human beings to determine for themselves truth and falsehood. Renaissance humanism was an intellectual movement typified by a revived interest in the classical world and studies which focused not on religion but on what it is to be human. The humanists of the Renaissance created schools to teach their ideas and wrote books all about education. Humanists sought to create a citizenry able to speak and write with eloquence and clarity. thus capable of engaging in the civic life of their communities and persuading others to virtuous and prudent actions. Baroque period from 1550s to about 1700s. The age of Italian Baroque literature marks the beginning of opera in the 17th century. The convergence of music and poetry in the form of the madrigal, a poetic genre set to music in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, became the foundation for opera as we still know it today. During this period, the Roman Catholic Church is heavily regulating the literature and art that is produced, so religious themes are also popular. It appears between the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. The fourth Italian literature is Classicism and Pre-Romanticism, from about 1700s to 1850s. Classicism asserts the importance of wholeness and unity. The work of art coheres without extraneous elements or open-ended conclusions. Classicism, both as an art style and as the first theory of art, was defined by the ancient Greeks, emulated by the Romans, and then continued to appear in various forms across the centuries. Pre-Romanticism was marked by a quickening of cultural nationalism and a new attention to national origins, as attested by the collection and imitation of native folklore, folk ballads and poetry, folk dance and music, and even previously ignored medieval and Renaissance works. The poets in this period used subjective autobiographical materials, which marked a new trend towards the expression of a lyrical and personal experience of life. They were less intellectual and more emotional, presenting a variety of emotional states of the soul. The fifth one is Romanticism and Realism period. From 1815 to about 1915, the term Romanticism does not stem directly from the concept of love, but rather from the French word romantique, a romantic story told in verse. Romanticism focused on emotions and the inner life of the writer, and often used autobiographical material to inform the work or even provide a template for it, unlike traditional literature. In the process of further development of Italian Romantic literature, its main genres are the historical novel and memoirs, historical drama, and socio-patriotic lyrics. Many of its aspects and features of Italian Romanticism are distinguished in the circle of contemporary Western European literatures. Romantic literature is marked by 6 primary characteristics. The first one is celebration of nature, focus on the individual and spirituality, celebration of isolation and melancholy, interest in the common man, idealization of woman, and personification and pathetic fallacy. Realism is an artistic movement that began in France in the 1850s, rejected Romanticism, instead seeking to portray contemporary subjects and situations with truth and accuracy. Realism rejects imaginative idealization in favor of a close observation of outward appearances. As such, realism in its broad sense compromised many artistic currents in different civilizations. The last major period in Italian literature, Decadentism and contemporary period, from 1915 to the present. The Decadent movement was a late 19th century artistic and literary movement centered in Western Europe that followed an aesthetic ideology of excess and artificiality. The word contemporary literature means belonging to or occurring in the now, which suggests that writers after 1940 were focusing on their feelings, emotions, and societies as they were experiencing them. The writing styles can vary, but the main idea is to convey realistic characters and experiences. Those are the six major periods of Italian literature. The medieval period or Middle Ages from 1200 to about 1400, Humanism and Renaissance period from about 1400s to about 1550s, Baroque period from 1550s to about 1700s, Classicism and Pre-Romanticism period from about 1700s to 1815, and Romanticism and Realism period from 1815 to about 1915, and the last, the Decadentism and Contemporary period from 1915 to the present. Next is Italian language, which derives mainly from Vulgar Latin and was the spoken language among commoners and less educated citizens of ancient Rome. If you have not known, Italian is a popular language of love and also one of the most practical languages to learn because Italy is a premier location for business across Europe. Knowing the language is an asset for personal growth and also a crucial business tool for participants of the global economy. Another additional information is Ritmo Laurenziano. It is the first extant document of Italian literature. It is the earliest surviving piece of poetry during the third quarter of the 12th century. Again, it is the first has even been hailed as the oldest piece of Italian poetry. And now let's move on to the greatest Italian poet, Dante Alighieri. He is described as the father of the Italian language, and in Italy he is often referred to as Il Sommo Poeta, the supreme poet. Dante is considered the greatest Italian poet, best known for the Divine Comedy, an epic poem that is one of the world's most important works of literature. Next, we will move on the three crowns of Italian literature. And they are Dante Alighieri again, Giovanni Boccaccio, and Francisco Petrarch. Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio are called the three crowns of Italian Renaissance literature and poetry due to the way their works foreshadowed the dramatic change Western civilization was about to undergo. These writers revolutionized literature even before the development of the printing press. No wonder Dante Alighieri is one of the crowns of Italian literature because if you remember, I mentioned it earlier that Dante is also the greatest Italian poet and considered as the father of Italian language. Next is the famous Italian writers and their notable works. Actually, there are many famous poets in Italy, but I only chose these people which I have considered them the most famous of all the famous Italian writers. And they are Dante Alighieri. His notable work is Divine Comedy. Francesco Petrarch with his Canzoniere literary works. Giovanni Boccaccio and his famous literary works is the Decameron. Alessandro Manzoni, which is very known with his literary works, The Betrothed. And last, Alberto Moravia, and his notable work is entitled Two Men. Women in Italian literature. Italian women writers have always been underrepresented in academia. In many collections of prominent and influential Italian literature, women's work are not included. The tradition of women writing has been much ignored due to the inferior position women have held in male-dominated societies. It is still not unheard of to see literature classes or anthologies in which women are greatly outnumbered by male writers or even entirely absent. The onus of women's literature, then, is to categorize and create an area of study for a group of people marginalized by history, and to explore through the writing their lives as they were while occupying such a unique sociopolitical space within their culture. That would be all for important features of Italian literature, and I really hope that all of you have gained learnings from my academic presentation. Thank you and God bless.